As most of you know very well by now, I often like to take my inspiration from my teishos from the Page a Day Zen calendar. And a few days ago, Tuesday, we had a quote from George Bernard Shaw. Now, of course, we don't take George Bernard Shaw as an expert on spiritual matters, and yet, if you know his work, like Joan of Arc, for example, a lot of spiritual insights. Even Pygmalion, My Fair Lady has some things to say about spirituality, I think. I won't give a teisho on that, I don't think, but there's a deeper reason for using it, because those of you who've been here recently, I've been comparing Siddhartha and Jesus, their life experience. At Christmas I did, their birth, and I talked about the baptism and the temptation at the beginning of Lent, and then the temptation of the Buddha before his enlightenment. And then last week I spoke about suffering and death as we approach Easter, and now and I'll be talking about also the resurrection on Easter week. So I recommend that to come for you to come for that. But his statement is that all great truths begin with blasphemy. All great truths start with a blasphemy. Now, I hope that's not entirely true. It might make life very difficult for spiritual people. But life is difficult for spiritual people, and that's part of the reason. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, there are different levels of understanding of the word blasphemy itself, I think. But I think it's associated to begin with the notion of leaving home, leaving a safe space to go into a place that is seemingly unsafe and dangerous, but which turns out to be actually a real home and the real safe space. And that's true in all the traditions. Speak about leaving home. They actually speak about that in Zen, the leaving home, and that you have to leave home, if not physically, although many do physically, towards a monastery, but leaving home interiorly. So Jung speaks about the hero's journey, that it always has to begin with a leaving home, leaving mommy behind, leaving behind the safe space that you grew up in, to go towards something unknown and dangerous, even a night sea journey, as Jung calls it, in some aspects. And of course, Jesus left home and left his native place, and so those who spiritual leaders who tend to speak too much about the cozy nuclear family as if this was the center of spirituality, well, that's not the spiritual program, the spiritual paradigm that we have in any tradition. And Jesus himself, of course, as you know, has nothing good to say about the nuclear family. You have to leave your wife and children and home and your own self. And who is my brother and my sister and my mother, my own followers. The Buddha himself, of course, Siddhartha that was the beginning of his spiritual journey. He left his palace, he left his family, he actually left a wife and son, and you can argue about that, but they were provided for, and his son, according to the story, I believe, later, of course, became his disciple. But so it's really important to be able to leave home, what's familiar. Now, of course, as Richard Rohr points out, you have to start with a home, you have to start with a tradition in order to be anchored and to get a certain identity in the world, a certain stability from which you can then leave. So you have to leave home, but you need a home to leave first. That is important. Those who don't ever have anything but a broken home, very, very hard to make spiritual progress. It can be done, but it's not. It's harder, Whereas those who never leave home because it's the safe little place, well, they can't make spiritual progress very far. So, in that sense, it's that this whole journey is tied into that basic dynamic of what is home. In the end, home has to be the whole cosmos. Our heart and our mind have to embrace the whole cosmos. So you know you're making spiritual progress. And I said this in a previous teisho, that when your heart is expanding and becomes more and more inclusive, that's the sign you're on the right path and you're finding your true home. And your heart is your true home. Home is where the heart is where home is. But to take this theme of what could be blasphemous as what you encounter along the way, you can see already that part of what you leave behind is a certain limited tribal tradition, whether it's religion or a country or whatever it might be, that's the safe. So that particular institution, political or religious, might consider it blasphemous, to move beyond that. And that's what we find, in Siddhartha and Jesus, for example, in both. Now, here, I just as an illustration, which is very complete and well presented, Houston Smith's The World's Religions, which I certainly recommend to everyone if you haven't already looked at it. Precisely in the section on Buddhism, he speaks about the rebel saint as the title of the chapter. But he says, to understand this better, and what I'm talking about now, he says, we should understand that there are he says 6 aspects of religion surface so regularly as to suggest that their seeds are in the human makeup. So whatever tradition, whatever world religion you're talking about, you're going to have these basic places in which you find a home, and legitimately, but which can also become obstructions. But that these features are part of any normal religion. And so he says, you have authority. You have ritual. And all these things are good, especially in the beginning. You need these things to become rooted and to get a certain direction, a certain orientation. You don't start at zero. You don't reinvent the wheel. So you have the whole tradition. That's the other thing. The constant is tradition. And then speculation about the tradition. Grace, that's part of a good feature generally. And then the 6th one is mystery. But all these things can be deformed, as he'll go on to explain. Now, as you probably know, or as he points out very clearly here, the Buddha was reacting against these things as they become too hardened, too complacent, too superficial in Hinduism. So that's where he's starting from. And so Buddha preached against a religion. He didn't say, I'm founding Buddhism. I mean, he's preaching, a way which goes beyond authority. And Jesus did the same thing. I mean, he pretty much flouted authority. He wasn't associated with the temple. John the Baptist wasn't. He was rooted in his own authority, That's what astonished the crowds. And the Buddha, of course, based on his own experience, taught. And he says you don't need the authority in the end. You have to become your own authority. As Jesus says himself, for example, you shall all be taught by God. Judge for yourself what is right, That we have to be rooted in our own experience and follow the challenges and follow the way out, like the Israelites going through the desert, or Abraham, who's in the gospel today, leaving his homeland behind. We have to leave. We have to be based on our own authority in the end, not in an egotistical way. I mean, that's the trap, of course. You're just following your own egotistical desires or insights, but ultimately you're coming from a deeper source, which is deep within you, as it is with Christ, as it is with the Buddha. Ritual. Well, ritual can be fine. I mean, we can't go to a Buddhist monastery in Tibet or anywhere else and not find a lot of ritual, and not find a lot of chanting. And I lived in a monastery myself, and there's a mass which I celebrate every day, in the Catholic liturgy. This can be fine if it's integrated into and expressive of and furthering the mystical truth, of the mystical reality of who we are and our relationship with that absolute reality. However we understand it. So if it's at the service of these things and fosters them, then that's what it's for. That's fine. But of course, we know that ritual can just become dead ritual, and whether it's Hinduism or Christianity or anything else. And that's a danger. And then you can be considered, blasphemous if you go beyond that, or to seem to discount that anyway. Not a lot of speculation, So Jesus certainly wasn't a theologian in the sense he's offering intellectual things. He preached in parables, and the Buddha, especially Zen, but Buddhism in general says, stop speculating about reality. Just relieve suffering, which is what Jesus did, going around and healing, and what the Buddha did in his preaching. And he quotes the famous parable of the arrow, which is used in Buddhism, that the Buddha used about, we're pierced with the arrow, of illusion and suffering. Do we speculate about what kind of the illusion is or what the arrow is, or we just take it out, remove it, find the practical wisdom, to move forward, and don't speculate, uselessly. And of course, it's easy to get lost in speculation and theological battles, which Catholics and Protestants and everybody else does too. We have to avoid that. And tradition is great, as I've said, but it can also become something you just hang on to, which can get in the way of moving forward. You have to, for example, take account, as the Dalai Lama often says himself, take account of modern science, modern psychology, new insights into the human person and into the world to better understand. Think how Galileo was considered blasphemous and a heretic because he said the Earth was not the center of the universe. I mean, come on. Well, and of course, we had the black hole today, and we're going to come back to that at the end. Not to jump in, but to get some insights from it. And an intense self-effort. That you have to be disciplined, but then both. Ultimately, you realize that it's not just about you. The ego can't get there. That there's something deeper supporting you, whatever you call it. There's something deeper carrying you, and with which we are ultimately identified. And that's the next thing I'll talk about. And then, interestingly, he says that Buddha preached a religion devoid of the supernatural. Now, what he means by that is, the divination, the forecasting, the soothsaying, the paranormal powers that yogis especially are actually gifted with, and they're accessible. But that's not what religion is about, the connection, the mystical connection with ultimate reality and with all of reality, with your neighbor, with the cosmos. These other things can become distractions. Think how often Jesus told people didn't want to work a miracle. He didn't want to work signs and wonders. He just wanted people to get the truth of what he was saying. And in that simplicity. And the Buddha didn't put any mark on any weight, any worth on that either. St. John of the Cross is another good example in the Catholic tradition, where he goes through all the different types of visions you can have and locutions you can have, and he said, if you get them, pay no attention, even if they're real. They'll have their own effect. Don't latch onto them. Don't cling to them. They're going to get in the way of this, pure leap into the abyss, into the black hole of the divine being. So there's a lot of similarity here of course, in the way that Jesus and Siddhartha conducted themselves, and they, brought about the ire or the disapproval of the establishment, ultimately breaking with, in the Buddhist case, breaking with Hinduism and founding something new. Jesus ultimately, doing something that branched out and became its own thing as well in Christianity. And, of course, that's what we're celebrating during this Passiontide, the fact that he so flouted authority and so broke the rules, curing on the Sabbath and all of these things, that he really did get into trouble. It was considered blasphemy. And we get even closer to the technical meaning of blasphemy when we look at what Jesus, at least according to the Gospel of John, why he was persecuted, because he said, as in today's Gospel, before Abraham came to be, I am. That ultimate I am. Soham in Hinduism, that I am, that actual fullness of being, And all the traditions say that we are, we're not that simple, not identified with that, not that without any kind of remainder, but that there's a non-dual connection, That's our ultimate reality too, our Christ reality, our Buddha nature, our Christ self. Christ is the elder brother. Christ is the one who actually is this absolute speaking and working in the world. But that was considered literally blasphemy, and that kind of immediate connection is what he was destroyed for. Now, the Buddha never made a claim like that. He simply said, "I'm awake," which, of course, and it wasn't he anymore. Remember his enlightenment experience, where he said, "I and the great mountains and the whole universe are now, find the way together." He recognized his connection with everything, the cosmic Christ, if you will. He recognized the connection, and the Buddha nature, as it came later to be called. And so it wasn't the ego I, who was speaking anymore, as the commentators point out. So once you're at that level, you're not speaking from the ego anymore. And that's considered blasphemous by people who are down on the lower level and thinking, what are you saying? You're saying you're God? What? There's a famous case 100 years ago in France. Massignon and Maritain wrote about this 10th century Islamic mystic, Mansur al-Hallaj, who was actually executed for saying, "I'm the truth." And the mystics, the Sufis, recognize, well, he's not saying that he is ultimate, but he's saying that in that union with that ultimate, you can actually say, what can you say? Well, you not say I am God, but you recognize your immediate connection, non-dual connection with ultimate reality, and that can seem blasphemous. Eckhart got into trouble for the same thing. John of the Cross was under suspicion for things like that, because on this lower level, of the institution and of speculation and of clear boundaries and all of that, it's problematic. So mystics and prophets are always, if they're doing their job right, are always going to be considered blasphemous in some way. So there we are with our friend, George Bernard Shaw. All great truths, begin as blasphemies, and that, literally blasphemy in that case that those cases we're just talking about. At least suspicion of that. But the great irony in all this is that the ones who are really committing blasphemy in the ultimate scheme of things are the ones that are holding on to their narrow little tribal definitions, of who God is, or their God, or what God is, in its tiny limitation. That's actually the idol. That's actually the blasphemy. That's the irony of it. That what society considers blasphemy is if you just look towards yourself and then find, wow, this is the real blasphemy, because I'm making God so small, so tiny. And here again, I said I'd come back to the black hole. This is where we can get, again, precisely from modern science, a whole new perspective on just the vastness of it all. I mean, you saw the pictures today, and you saw the articles that, I don't have the exact numbers right, but this is like 55 million light years away that they photographed. I mean, can you imagine light traveling for a year, 55 million years? I mean, and the volume of the black hole's light was like 4 billion suns? Billion suns. And to be able to coordinate the cameras, the 7 cameras, whatever they were, 5 cameras that were taking the picture over several days. The article I read in the Times said it's like trying to read the date on a quarter in Los Angeles from Washington, D.C. I mean, if the universe is this big, what about the ultimate reality? And here we are arguing about whose little container is the best, whose little speculation, whose little words or concepts are the best. Please. So if you're not running any danger of blasphemy, you're probably, looks like everybody is somehow, if we're not careful. So unless you're branching out way beyond your comfort zone, you're probably worshiping an idol. And that's where the blasphemy is. But given people as they are and ourselves as we start out, if we dare to become the mystics and prophets that we're called to be, we'll run into trouble too, maybe accused of things like that. But let that not stop you, because it's a great adventure, and we have all the power and impetus within to reach out, or not to grasp, but as last Sunday's liturgy is quoted from St. Paul, not that we grasp it, but that we have been grasped and held and tossed, into the great mystery.